Hi, I'm Dave, and welcome to this Red Cloud Photography video tutorial. Today we're going to look at Aperture, and to help you understand more about how to take even better photos. So let's get started. So one of the key secrets to taking great pictures is to make sure you get the exposure right. And by exposure, we mean the correct amount of light entering the camera to take the picture that you desire. So when we talk about exposure, there are three key factors to consider: the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture size. We've got some great tutorials that will talk about ISO and shutter speed, but in this one, let's focus on the aperture. So let's take our camera and set the dial to A in this model, because it's a Nikon, and a Canon you'd set it to AV. In setting this to A, it means that the camera will now control the shutter speed to give me the correct exposure for the aperture that I choose. So the aperture itself is housed in the lens and is a hole which controls the amount of light which enters through to the sensor of the camera. So a really good way to see this is to think about the pupil in your eye. If you think about your pupil during the day, it's really quite small, which is reducing the amount of light entering your eye because it's really bright. Whereas if you think about it at night, the pupil becomes much larger, allowing more light in so that you can still see correctly. And it's exactly the same with aperture. Each aperture is represented by a number, which we call an f-stop. Each number represents a different size of aperture, which typically ranges from f1.4, the largest, to f36, which is the smallest. Now I know this seems a little counterintuitive, but as long as you remember, the smaller the number, the wider the aperture. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture. So as we move up the sequence of apertures, we halve the amount of light entering the camera for each f-stop. And conversely, as we come down, we double the amount of light entering. So f5.6 allows half the amount of light into the camera that f2.8 does. So apart from controlling the light, there's one other really cool thing that aperture allows you to do. So we can use the aperture to control the depth of field. That is the amount of the final image that appears to be in sharp focus. If you look at this tape measure example, if we use an aperture of f2.8, only a small part of the tape measure appears in focus. If you now watch as we change the aperture to f22, for example, much more of the tape measure becomes focused. So let's have a look at this in a real life example. So here we've got an example of depth of field using aperture control. I've got a really nice park bench here in front of me with a really nice inscription across it, and I want to take a photograph of that inscription going all the way across. So at the moment I've got my aperture set really wide to f1.8, and I'm going to take the first shot. There we go, and now I'm going to adjust it to f7.1, which is a smaller aperture, so less light's getting in, but I'm increasing the depth of field on the picture. So here we go again. Change it to 7.1, take the picture, okay? And then my final example is going to be at f22, so I'm really going to close the aperture right down, which gives me the maximum depth of field, which should give me the whole of the inscription in focus. So f22, take the picture, and what we'll do now, we'll review the results and see what we find. So in this image of the bench, where we've used an aperture of 1.8 and actually focused on the centre of the inscription, we see that the centre is nicely in focus and we can read it very clearly, whereas the foreground and the background are both out of focus and actually blurred to the point where you can't read them properly. On this photograph, where the aperture was set to 7.1, the focus is much more consistent across the whole of the inscription. However, you still lose a little bit of detail towards the end, particularly at the far end of the inscription. And finally, if we look at this picture, where the aperture was set to f22, we see that the inscription is in focus across the full range of the photograph, even though we are still focused on the centre of the bench. So here we've got another example of using aperture to control depth of field. I'm going to take a couple of portrait shots using a really small aperture, so f22, which will give me a very long depth of field, and a shot using a medium aperture, which will narrow that depth of field, and then finally a shot using a really small aperture, probably f1.6, that will give us a really shallow depth of field in a portraiture shot. So we've got our model Claire waiting over there. Let's not keep her any longer. So I'm now going to take the first shot of Claire at f22. So here we go. Okay, so that's a really small aperture giving us a long depth of field. Now I'm going to change the settings to f7.1. There we go. And another shot. Cracking. Right, okay, and finally we're going to go to f1.6. So change the camera settings down to 1.6 and take the photo. Ready, Claire? There we go. So let's have a look at the results. The subject is standing behind quite a busy background, and using an f-stop of f22, which gives a very deep depth of field, the subject is kind of lost in the background with the foliage and the plants coming out. If we look at the next image, which was taken at an f-stop 7.1, there's a little bit more blur in the background, so the model is starting to stand out a little bit. In this final image, taken at f1.6, you can see how the background is much more blurred, which really helps the model stand out. When we talk about depth of field for a landscape photograph, we really want to be using a very large f number, which gives us a small aperture. That gives us a very deep depth of field. So I've set up a shot here where I've got a sundial plinth in the foreground and the hall in the background, and I'm going to take 3 shots. The first shot I'm going to take at f1.8, which is a very large aperture, which will give me a very shallow depth of field, and I'm going to focus on the hall. I'll then take a shot at f7.1, which will increase the depth of field, and then finally I'll take a shot at f22, very small aperture, very long depth of field, and that will bring everything into a sharp focus. So let's take these shots. So the first one is at 1.8. There we go. And then I'm moving up to f7.1 and taking the shot again. And finally f22. There we go. And if we go through these 3 shots, we'll see what I mean by the change in depth of field. So looking at this first image, which is an unusual composition granted, but it does show the effect that if focusing on the hall in the background with a very, very wide aperture, f1.8, giving us a very shallow depth of field, the plinth in the foreground is completely blurred out and really does look odd. Whereas if we change the aperture size to 7.1, we start to get more definition, as we see in this image, of the plinth in the foreground. But it's still not quite right. So let's look at the final image. Here we see, using an f-stop of 22, that the entire image is in sharp focus, both the hall in the background and the plinth in the foreground. This is what we usually expect to see in a good landscape photograph. Here are some more examples of how to use the aperture size to control the depth of field. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this red cloud photography tutorial on Aperture, and it's really helped improve your photography. Please check out our website for more information on our other tutorials and the courses that we run, and we hope to see you at one soon. Cheers.